I was explaining to our next guest on the break, my disdain for public sector bureaucrats is high today because I've been forced to sit through a committee hearing where they showed up with no answers and no sense of accountability whatsoever. And apparently, we're going to get more of the same. Joining us now is good friend of Rebel News and good friend of taxpayers, Franco Terrazzano of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, to talk about Justin Trudeau's public sector hiring spree. More bureaucrats to annoy me in committees. Franco, thanks for coming on the show. Tell us what's happening with the public sector hiring spree as Canadians are just struggling to make ends meet. We're getting more highly paid bureaucrats and all the federal benefits that go along with it.
Well, Sheila, I mean, look at your tax bill. Look at the massive debt bill under the Trudeau government. And one of the reasons, a big reason both of those are going up is because of Trudeau's out of control bureaucrat hiring spree. So last year, Trudeau added another 10,000 bureaucrats to the taxpayer dole. But even that doesn't shine a light on the true problem, because since Trudeau first became the prime minister, he has added more than 108,000 federal paper pushers. Folks, he has added more than 108,000 bureaucrats in less than a decade. That is a 42% increase in the number of federal bureaucrats in less than a decade. And I mean, just ask yourself, are you getting 42% more from the federal government? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. If you're not getting a taxpayer check, the answer is a big fat no.
Now, the other side of this argument, the big government side of the argument, would say, well, they're just keeping pace with Canada's growing economy. But the Taxpayers Federation drilled down, and that's not true whatsoever.
No, not even close. I mean, look at Canada's population growth over that same time. Canada's population grew by 14%. The bureaucracy grew by 42%. So it's not even close. And in fact, if the bureaucracy had just grown to keep pace with population, we'd have 70,000 fewer federal bureaucrats working for the federal government. And again, folks, like, this is just crazy, right? That the fact that Trudeau, since becoming prime minister less than a decade ago, has added more than 108,000 federal bureaucrats for an increase of 42%. It's crazy.
Well, and I don't think Canadians are getting better service. Like, for that many bureaucrats, we should be getting concierge service. Just to put this in context, Justin Trudeau has hired as many bureaucrats as the population of Red Deer, Alberta. And that's just been added to the federal payroll, but also to federal pension liabilities. But I don't think you could talk to a Canadian out there who's tried to, let's say, renew their passport, call the CRA, that the level of service that Canadians are getting is somewhere anywhere near the number of dollars we're spending on public sector bureaucrats.
No, not even close. I'm glad you brought up the CRA. I mean, trying to get the CRA on the phone, I mean, good luck with that, hey, folks. And like, when you mentioned that the growth in the bureaucracy, it's about the size of Red Deer, Alberta, that's not the total bureaucracy. That's just the new number of bureaucrats that Trudeau has hired in the last less than a decade, right? Because the total number of federal bureaucrats now, when you don't count those who are in the military or active RCMP officers, is now 367,000 federal bureaucrats. Then there's all the provincial bureaucrats you're paying for, all the municipal bureaucrats. But Sheila, you kind of touched on this when you mentioned the pension obligations that taxpayers are paying for. It's not just the size of the bureaucracy that has grown out of control. The cost of the bureaucracy has grown out of control as well. In fact, since 2016, the cost of the federal bureaucracy has gone up 68%. And you might be scratching your head asking yourself, why? It's because we're paying for a bigger bureaucracy collecting bigger paychecks. So over the last 4 years alone, Trudeau has handed out more than 1 million pay raises. Now, think about the last 4 years and let that sink in. Number one, services have been atrocious, right? We all remember the horror stories of the long lineups to try to get a passport. But number two, and more to the point, what has happened to the private sector over the last 4 years? Lockdowns, right? Job losses, business losses, some business owners closing up shop for good. Then you have an inflation crisis where Canadians struggle to afford the necessities like rising rent payments and grocery hauls. So all during that time, Trudeau has taken more money from the people who pay the bills around here, the private sector taxpayers, and handed out more than 1 million pay raises in just the last 4 years alone.
Now, do we know if these are bureaucrats that will actually have to go to a physical building to work? Because I know that that is a big deal for public sector bureaucrats these days. They love working from home. And are these ones that are going to have to go to a physical building? Like, if we don't notice you back at the office, maybe we don't need you. What's going to happen to these ones? Or are they just the work at home luxury ones where we have to buy them a fancy chair so they can sit next to it on their couch all day and clickety clack on their computer?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. And I'm not really sure where the dispute is at this moment, but your audience will probably remember in the last couple of months or so, you had the main federal union boss who essentially was like trying to light their hair on fire about having these bureaucrats go to the office about 3 times a week, right? So what you had are these whining, overpaid federal bureaucrats complaining that they have to show up to the office about the same amount of time or less than what anyone in the private sector would really be forced to do. And, who are the people who should be complaining right now? Not these overpaid federal government bureaucrats. The people who should be complaining right now are taxpayers, right? Because just think about the last few years alone, right? Where the federal government has added tens of thousands of extra bureaucrats, has rubber stamped hundreds of millions of dollars in bonuses, handed out more than 1 million pay raises in the last couple years alone. Meanwhile, taxpayers still aren't getting good services. The only thing that taxpayers seem to be getting out of this deal are a higher tax bill. Now, Sheila, I've mentioned the more than 108,000 federal bureaucrats being added since Trudeau became prime minister. I've mentioned the more than 1 million pay raises over the last 4 years to federal bureaucrats. I haven't even mentioned the most infuriating part of all of this is the fact that Trudeau has rubber stamped more than $1 billion in bonuses. Taxpayer-funded bonuses, by the way, to federal bureaucrats when federal departments can't even meet half of their own performance targets consistently. And Sheila, it's not like these are the performance targets from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. These are performance targets that they set for themselves, and they still can't meet barely half of them, and doesn't matter, bonuses anyways.
Right. We saw this with the CBC. Nobody watches the CBC. Except I think grandparents who don't know how to change the remote control. Like, that's the greatest thing that Canadian grandchildren can do for the state of the country is teach their grandparents how to use the remote control so they're not obligated to watch the CBC. But nobody's watching the CBC. A statistical rounding error of Canadians watch their flagship news coverage, and yet it is nothing but a fire hose of bonuses being shot in the faces of CBC bureaucrats.
Well, you'll remember that last year, the CBC handed out, $15 million in taxpayer-funded bonuses, all while their president, CEO, Catherine Tate, was claiming chronic underfunding, right, begging the government for more taxpayer cash. And, I don't know what's worse, right? The fact that Tate still had enough money to hand out in bonuses while she's claiming chronic underfunding, or the fact that Tate thinks the CBC is chronically underfunded when they take more than $1 billion from taxpayers every single year. I'm not sure what's worse. But it's not just the CBC, right? It's not just the state broadcaster. You have the Bank of Canada, another failing crown corporation who has one job: keep inflation low and around 2%. Well, over the last 3 years, they completely failed to do their one and only job, yet they still rubber stamped around $60 million in bonuses. Or how about this one? The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, another failing crown corporation. Sheila, they have repeatedly claimed that they have one objective above all others: housing affordability for all. Well, over the last 4 years, Canadians couldn't afford to buy a home, yet they still rubber stamped like $100 million in bonuses over the last 4 years alone.
And it's going to get worse, much, much worse, because we know Justin Trudeau is scaling up the bureaucracy even more. He's got 3 new bureaucracies just to impose his censorship legislation. And then the Competition Bureau has this extra power now to censor the oil patch. That'll require more bureaucrats. So I think this is just the tip of the iceberg if Justin Trudeau continues to govern this country.
I'm glad you brought up the so-called online harms bill and the fact that the parliamentary budget officer only looked at like some of the aspects that pertain to this new piece of legislation and said, like, look, this is going to cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. This is going to require like 300 new censorship bureaucrats snooping around what you say, see, read, and hear online. And, Sheila, if this was really about actually going after legitimate criminals, well, who do you call when you have to go after a criminal? Do you call a bureaucrat in Ottawa, or do you call the police? I think we all know the answer to that. So if this was really about going after criminals, and if it wasn't about online censorship, then why wouldn't they just hire 300 police officers rather than 300 plus online hall monitors? I think we all know the answer to that.
Indeed, we do, especially us here at Rebel News. Franco, tell us how people can find the work that you do at the Taxpayers Federation, and more importantly, support the work that you do to hold the government to account on behalf of the little guy.
Well, number one, you can find us pretty much on all social media platforms. Just type in Canadian Taxpayers Federation. If you want to follow me, at Franco_nomics. But the best place that you can go to is taxpayer.com. Taxpayer.com, check out our newsroom, sign some petitions, and I think that's the best way to stay up to date with the work that we're doing.
Great. Thanks so much, Franco. We'll have you back on again very soon.
Hey, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Stay with us. Your letters to Ezra, read by me, up after the break.